Hello and welcome. I'm Anand Naidu, sitting in for Riz Khan. America's economic clout around the world has been described as, quote, greed run wild. In his new book, The Secret History of American Empire, author John Perkins reveals how big government and mega corporations work to expand America's global reach, mostly to the detriment of poor countries. Perkins contends that war, geopolitical instability, and even global warming are widening the gap between rich and poor, a situation he says is no longer sustainable. Don't forget, we take your calls on this program. The question we are asking today is, does America use its economic power to help others or only itself? The numbers are there at the bottom of your screen. John Perkins, welcome to the show.
It's great to be here with you. Thank you.
Now, we're talking about your latest book, and the subtitle is The Truth About Economic Hitmen, Jackals, and How to Change the World. Now, for the sake of our viewers, let's define economic hitmen and jackals.
Well, I think it's fair to say that we economic hitmen have created the world's first truly global empire without the military. And we do this many different ways, but perhaps the most common is that we'll identify a third world country that has resources our corporations covet, like oil, and then arrange a huge loan to that country from the World Bank or one of its sisters. But the money never actually goes to the country. It goes to our own corporations instead to build infrastructure projects, power plants and industrial parks, things that benefit a few very rich people in that other country, as well as our own corporations, but don't help the majority of the people who are too poor to buy electricity or don't have the skills to get jobs in industrial parks. However, they're left holding a huge debt. And at some point, we economic hitmen go back and say, listen, you can't pay this debt, so give us a pound of flesh. Sell your oil real cheap to our oil companies. Vote with us on the next critical United Nations vote, or send troops in support of ours to someplace in the world like Iraq. When we fail, which isn't very often, then the jackals are sent in. And these are people who overthrow governments or assassinate their leaders. So when I failed with Omar Torrijos in Panama, for example, and Jaime Roldos in Ecuador, jackals were sent in, CIA orchestrated jackals who assassinated these two presidents.
And what was the original, let's say, commodity that you couldn't get, or influence that you couldn't get from these leaders?
Well, in the case of Ecuador, we were after their oil. Ecuador has a huge pool of oil that we've since exploited, and Jaime Roldos would not buy into this. He said, you know, Ecuador's oil must profit Ecuador's poor people, not just big foreign corporations. And in the case of Panama, it was the Panama Canal.
You know, some may say that the book is a conspiracy theorist's delight because of what you outlined there. I mean, the book, you know, it talks about basically a parallel world, an unseen world, a world in which people operate in the dark. Does it exist even today?
Absolutely, it exists, and you know, the conspiracy theory idea I shudder at, because it's not a conspiracy. The people who run this, which I call the corporatocracy, basically the people who run our biggest corporations, they have the most power today. They basically control most of our politicians and our mainstream media, but they don't have to conspire to do this. They're all driven by a single goal, which is to maximize profits regardless of the social and environmental costs. And having that goal in mind, they work in many different ways. Oil companies work differently from agricultural companies, which work differently from clothes manufacturing companies, but they're all headed toward that one goal. And so they encourage politicians, force politicians in many ways to pass laws that help them exploit labor pools around the world and natural resources around the world. It isn't a conspiracy, but it is a case where many different organizations walk down different paths, all headed toward the same goal of maximizing profits regardless of social and environmental costs.
Now, you mentioned at the outset, you know, there are hundreds of millions of dollars, perhaps billions of dollars that's granted to certain countries for development projects, and you say this money is actually diverted. It comes back to America through its corporations. Give us some examples of where that's happened.
You name any country that has resources we covet, and you can see this happening. You know, it's Nigeria, for example, with the oil there, Ecuador with the oil there, Congo with coltan, and diamonds in Africa, and oil in Nigeria. So many different places all through the Middle East where we convince the American people that we're doing this to help these countries. And most American people seem to believe that foreign aid is altruistic. But in fact, almost none of it's altruistic, with a few exceptions. Most of it goes to come right back to our our companies, it's a great deal. I get you to take on a loan from a major bank so that you can hire me to do something for you, and then you owe the bank back, but the thing I do for you really doesn't help you very much. It really helps me a great deal, however, but you owe the bank. And that's really the way this whole thing is set up.
You mentioned Congo just now. You write quite a bit about Congo. Tell us about Congo in your book.
Well, I think one of the most shocking things is that most people in the United States don't realize that so much of our technology, from iPods and computers to cell phones, it has to have a mineral in it called coltan. And coltan only comes out of the Congo. And in the last 10 years, an estimated 4 million people have died mining coltan and in the coltan wars, so that we can have cheap cell phones and computers. And these people live terrible, terrible lives. So the big corporations that are going in and extracting the coltan and using it to make their products, their executives are getting very highly paid. Their stockholders are doing very well. We're getting cheap technology here, and the people who are providing the material that goes into this are living terrible, miserable lives, dying. 4 million in a decade, that's a tremendous number. That's a horrible shame. We all ought to see this differently and pay a little more money for these products, make sure those executives don't pay themselves quite as much, maybe the stockholders don't make quite as high returns, but the people who are providing this service and this product for us ought to be able to have decent wages where they can, and health insurance and retirement funds, rather than living these terrible lives. Basically, they're living as slaves.
Had a similar situation in West Africa, didn't we, with diamonds?
Yes. Absolutely, and a movie like Blood Diamond really kind of brings this to the forefront. We've done this with diamonds, we've done it with copper, we've done it with bauxite, we're doing it with agricultural products also in the world, and of course oil. It's a common practice that when a country has resources that our corporations want, we go to drastic measures. And the really sad part about this is I think that it doesn't benefit anyone in the long run. What it's done is to create an unstable world where there's a lot of desperation and anger. We saw this boil up at 9/11, for example, and I'm not condoning what happened at 9/11, but I am saying that I think the American people need to understand that this way of conducting ourselves in the world is creating a very unstable, dangerous world which doesn't serve any of us and certainly doesn't serve our children and grandchildren.
What about a situation where the leaders of certain countries do not basically toe the American line? And I think specifically, especially in this hemisphere, of people like Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, Evo Morales in Bolivia. Does the American establishment here, let's say the corporate establishment, work to undermine those leaders?
We have, but a very interesting thing is happening in Latin America today, in that 9 countries representing more than 80% of the population of South America have voted in a president who's standing up to us, who's saying, Ecuador's oil needs to benefit Ecuador's poor people. Bolivia's gas needs to benefit Bolivia's poor people. And these presidents have been elected in democratic elections, no violence. It's an amazing thing that's going on. And every one of these countries during most of my lifetime was run by a brutal dictator who was under Washington's thumb. But in the last few years, that's all changed. There's an amazing revolution going on in Latin America. And Hugo Chavez has to get a lot of credit for setting the stage for that. Now, you can think whatever you want about Hugo Chavez and the way he speaks, and sometimes it really turns me off, his histrionics and so on and so forth. But the fact is, he's democratically elected, has won election after election, and he lost one and gave in to it. He didn't try to, overrule the voting public. And he, by resisting the coup of 2002, he was actually overthrown by a CIA-orchestrated coup, but got back into power within 2 days. He set a stage which sent a message to the people of many other countries in Latin America that the great empire to the north could be defied and a president could get away with it.
And how would, let's say, the political establishment in Washington respond to something like that?
Well, typically in the past, after Chavez got back in power in 2002, we would have sent in the big guns, including military people, and really gone after him. But in 2002, we were terribly overextended in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so I think the Bush administration kind of let that slip through their fingers because they didn't know how to respond to it. And the other aspect is that there's a tremendous amount of oil in Venezuela and in what we call the Amazon Crescent, which stretches from Venezuela through Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, into Bolivia and parts of Brazil. Huge amounts of oil. People estimate that maybe there's more than in the Middle East. And we're afraid right now that we're going to lose the Middle East and that oil supply. Washington's afraid of that. And if that happens, then having this huge deposit in our backyard becomes very, very important strategically. And so I think we've had to walk a careful line with Chavez. And Chavez is very sharp. He knew how to overcome this coup. He's one of the few people that really knew the ropes and was able to bring off a counter coup and get himself back in power.
You know, there was an interesting situation in Bolivia very recently, actually, where the wealthy part of the country had a referendum deciding that the wealth that was generated in that part of the country would stay in that part of the country, and President Evo Morales doesn't want that. He wants the wealth to be distributed throughout the country to the poorer areas as well. But at the end of that referendum, which was overwhelmingly for the wealth staying in that part of the country, he appeared to be backing down.
Well, yeah, it's a tough position. That's the Santa Cruz area you're talking about. And I was with Evo Morales on New Year's Eve a year ago. And I spent a lot of time in Latin America. I speak Spanish, and he's in a very, very difficult position. The right-wing opposition is very strongly opposed to him, backed by the United States. He said that the ambassador from the United States is planning a coup against him. And B, his own people, the indigenous people, the poor people, love him, but they expected that when he came into power, suddenly everything would change overnight. It would be a miracle. And of course that hasn't happened. So Morales is in a tough position. I think he's finding that he's going to have to make some compromises along these lines, and I think that's what you're referring to.
Yeah. We're going to take a break right now. More of our discussion about America's economic empire after a short break. Stay with us. We'll be back in a moment.